Good evening. Good evening. Spiritual warriors. That was my shadow. How's everybody this evening? Welcome, welcome, welcome to Krishna.com Live, Spiritual Warriorship. My name is Mother Indrani, and we are discussing and reading from the books of His Holiness Bhakti Tirtha Swami Maharaj. And there's so much to cover in this chapter we're on, Spiritual Warrior 4, Conquering the Enemies of the Mind. And if you're wondering what they are, they will be mentioned later. And we're on chapter 3, Managing Anger. There's so much that he's given us in this chapter. I get excited in bringing it to you, sharing it with you, and hopefully encouraging you to bring balance into your life and your consciousness. So I won't go into the regular, repeated spiritual warriorship info. Hopefully many of you are coming back. And if anyone's here for the first time and anything you hear, you have a question, you can put it in the chat room and we'll try to answer. So let's move right along into chapter 3, Managing Anger, from Spiritual Warrior 4. Now what I'm going to do as I try brief review, and then we'll get into the new information. Alright, he starts off by stating that a person who desires liberation from this material world should not fall under the control of anger, because when bewildered by anger, one becomes a source of dread for all others. This is from Srimad Bhagavatam, chapter 4, Canto 4, chapter 11. So just think about just those few words. We are all prone to getting angry at some time and going off, but listen carefully so we can learn how to manage it and bring some balance to our lives. The next section he calls the pervasiveness of anger, where he states, he's saying as we embark on this topic, we should take the time to ask ourselves if we have an anger problem, or if we feel unable to deal with our anger. Want to take a moment to think about that? Do we, I'm including myself, do we have an anger problem? Or do we feel unable to deal with our anger? He states we might, if we do that, we might discover that we do in fact have a problem with anger that we simply cannot recognize. He tells us further, in this Spiritual Warrior series, we recognize our consciousness to be the battlefield and our weapons to be genuine knowledge, integrity, compassion, and love. And those that have been following us and participating in these discussions, we've gone to work through some chapters in Spiritual Warrior 2, Transforming Lust into Love, Spiritual Warrior 3, Solace for the Heart in Difficult Times. And from that book, remember, we did 12 qualities of a spiritual warrior, and we're now on working on Spiritual Warrior 4. And if you've been following closely, you'll see how Bhakti Tirtha Swami, the essence of all he's giving, these are qualities and characteristics we all have, at some point in our lives in this material world, but he's helping us to observe them and work through them because we are spiritual beings. Remember, School of Love? The spirit, the soul is made for love, and he's trying to encourage us towards that love and love of God and love of each other. So it's just wonderful to see how he weaves this and works it and brings us to know who we are as spiritual beings. He says anger basically results from all the other enemies of the mind. Enemies such as envy, greed, madness, illusion, fear, and especially lust, all lead to anger, which sometimes manifests in very unhealthy ways. Underlying, he says, all the enemies of the mind, which we just noted, we will find that lust, or simply misdirected love. The next section we mentioned last time was titled Triggers of Anger. Now, do you remember? He gave us some shoulds there. Now, he states in this section we want to examine which expressions, thoughts, and actions trigger our anger. Do you hear that? Expressions, thoughts, or action trigger our anger. It's good to have a sense of what snaps, or what you say, you push my button. But what is it that did it? What expression, thought, or action? He says this relates to what we call shoulds and blamers, which all lead to anger. The main problem is that anger leads to more anger, and violence leads to more violence. Another person may not see a situation in the same way and may not even understand that they have hurt us. Even if they did consciously try to hurt us, we will not help solve the issue by coming down to their level. You see what he's saying? And we've all been in situations when somebody will say something, or somebody gets upset or blows off or calls us a name or something. But if we react to that, we're going down to another level and where they are, and this is what he's telling us we don't want to do. He states to degrade or dehumanize, that word he uses, dehumanize ourselves in this way will only bring defeat and weakness in spiritual life. Remember, this is called spiritual warriorship. It means we are endeavoring for a strong spiritual life and spiritual understanding of who we are in relation to God. And if you degrade yourself, he said, or dehumanize yourself, it'll only bring defeat and weakness in your spiritual life. So spiritual life is the goal, it's the key, it's where we're heading, endeavoring to head. And he's giving us the tools and techniques to get rid of obstacles that may keep us from going there. He says, we will allow another person's weakness or an author's to dictate our life, since the past will preoccupy our present and future. It will drain us of our spiritual strength and power. And we don't want that to happen. So remember, he gave us 5 shoulds I'm going to go through those quickly so we can get through the 4 blamers, and there's plenty more after that. Remember the 5 shoulds. We were blessed last week, if you were on, that Bhuvan Mohan actually wrote them out. I saw the screen after we went off the air, and I thought that was very kind of him to do. So in case you wanted to make notes, or if I read too fast, which I try not to do, you could see it. Sometimes if you see it, you remember it better. And I didn't ask any questions yet for you to share if you've noticed a change in any anger habits you may have, and if you're managing better. Because last week we asked about anxieties, if you had found you were able to be less anxious. So if you have anything to share where you see improvement in your life by these techniques and technologies of His Holiness Bhakti Tirtha Swami, you could make a note of it on the chat room, in the chat room. Okay, 5 shoulds. Number 1. Since I have a desire, other people should respond to my desire. Hope that's not you. His comment on that: we can easily recognize the inherent problem with this mentality. First of all, other people also have their own desires, which may not always harmonize with our own. In order to rectify this unhealthy tendency, we need to abandon selfishness, value other people more, and become more reflective. 2. Since I have a certain ideal or standard, other people should also have the same exact one. What? He says, his comment: if someone strays from our standard, we may resort to anger. It all depends on our mentality. We often think that others should have the same mentality or code of ethics, even though their situations may differ from our own. Number 3, if a problem, in quotes, if a problem develops, the other person should change. Have any of you had that mentality? He says, when problems arise, we sometimes want the other person to change instead of us. If the other person does not change, and we I did it again. Adamantly maintain our mindset, we will again develop anger. We need to recognize that their perceptions, karma, or realization may completely differ from our own. The other person may, in fact, want to change, but we also need to acknowledge that he or she may not feel a need to change due to their situation. Number 4, if you love me and care for me, you should do X, Y, and Z. Now, this should depend on an assumption. The result that we expect depends on an assumed reality that we have about how the other person thinks, which will automatically dictate their actions. And 5, since you have hurt me and I feel hurt, I should take revenge. Due to some negative interaction in a relationship, one person may want to hurt the other person in return, which is obviously unhealthy. Okay? Now, he's giving us 4 blamers, which also lead to anger. Number one, when we see everything in black and white, we will blame another person if something strays from our narrow vision. Listen carefully. His comment. Many people have an extremely narrow vision. They do not try to understand the essence or some of the important mitigating factors of a situation. Consequently, they quickly become disturbed if something does not fit into their limited evaluation and perspective. Number two, blamer. When we think that we understand the mind of another person, we will put labels on him or her and even blame him or her if they do not act according to those labels. Hope you're listening carefully. He's giving us quite a bit in depth here. His commentary. When people try to read the mind of another person, they will naturally become angry when he or she does not act accordingly. We can see the inherent problem here, because in this practice, unless a person has some unusual psychic powers, he or she will usually make incorrect assumptions. The other person's thoughts may even directly oppose the assumption. Number three.
Can you give an example of that one? Can you give an example of that one?
Give an example of when people try. Well, have you ever tried reading somebody's mind? And you know it doesn't work. When people try to read the mind of another person, they will become angry when he or she does not act accordingly. So if you're trying to read a mind, what you're really doing is assuming that person is thinking like you're thinking and will act in a situation the way you would. And that's the problem. I hope that helps. And I think we've all maybe even had that experience of saying to somebody, you're trying to read my mind, or if they get angry at something you do, I remember the expression used, I'm not a mind reader, because the communication wasn't clear as to what action or whatever was said really meant, and that person gets angry or you get angry and it gets into a thing, I'm not a mind reader, you know. Didn't you know when I did so and so that that's how it should be? No, because I'm not a mind reader. But sometimes we get into that and we put labels on people and then we blame them if they don't act the way we want, but they're acting by their own consciousness. Number three, if a person disturbs us, we exaggerate by making extreme generalizations that cover over the whole relationship. For instance, a person may claim, this always happens. You always act in the same way. Although the incident may have only happened once or twice, we allow our whole perception of the situation to change. We exaggerate the situation with the words always or never. You always leave the door open when you go out. I tell you I want you to close the door and lock it if I'm not here or whether. You always, and what? It may have just happened one time, the person forgot. We exaggerate the situation with the words always and never, which now causes us to overreact in an irate type of mood. Blamers always blame the other person. So be mindful. Watch yourself. Watch your words, your actions, your mood. If you're starting to blame somebody, look at yourself. That's what he's been saying throughout this. And number 4, due to a behavior that we do not appreciate, we now attach a label onto another person and categorize the person according to that label. For example, you may label a person a jerk, imbecile, moron, or fool. And this label will influence your entire perception of them. Even if they act in admirable ways, due to this label, your anger will overpower the relationship or the moment. Now, as we've noticed with all of Bhakti Tirtha Swami's instructions and techniques and technologies and showing us where the obstacles are in our spiritual growth, he then comes and gives us techniques and technologies to help us to overcome. This next section is called 9 Positive Ways to Deal with Shoulds and Blamers. I'm excited about this one. Okay, you ready? Number 1, avoid self-centeredness or selfishness. Who, me? I'm not selfish. Listen, he states, comment, by abandoning our own selfishness, we will find it much easier to understand someone else's viewpoint or position. That means we have to take our mind off ourselves and I'm always right, I know I'm right. You know that attitude. I know most of you spiritual warriors out there, you aren't there. But we have to listen and be aware if someone else has that attitude. He says it will help us to understand their actions, pain, hurt, or needs. Because that person may be saying and acting in that way because they're in pain or they've been hurt or they have a special need. And if we're not just thinking of ourselves, we'll be giving some attention to what may be disturbing them. He says it's not just a matter of being right. Rather, it is a matter of producing a loving effect. A genuine spiritualist never just wants to be right. Actually, a person with this mindset is a Jnani or philosopher who will never reach the deep level of bhakti or devotion. We want to be right in the right way so that we can constantly honor, embrace, and glorify God. So yes, you may be right at that moment in the discussion or situation. And yet, if you're not just thinking of yourself, I know I'm right, and I don't know where you're coming from. You may have an attitude, I know I'm right, but let me listen and see what's going on with Jim, Joe, Jane. And if you're listening sometime and you take your mind up, you will detect that person may be in pain or may be expressing some hurt feelings they have with somebody else. And this way, it's not, as he said, about being right. but we want to be right in the right way so that we can constantly honor, embrace, and glorify God. And God is in everybody's heart. So if you are selfless and paying attention, you are honoring God in that person. Another positive way to deal with should and blamers. Avoid assumptions when we judge. Commentary. The mind is so wild and prone to all kinds of speculation. And that statement, I'm sure, is not a new statement to anyone out there. That mind is so wild and prone to all kinds of speculation. So consequently, we must be careful before we jump to prejudiced conclusions. Number 3, first change ourselves so that we can help affect others. Here he goes again, telling us we have got to work on ourselves. His commentary. We can think, what changes do I need to make in my own life? What changes do I need to make in my own life so that I can encourage that change in someone else? Remember, where was that? Introspection. I believe it was in the first chapter on excessive anxiety, where he speaks of introspection. But in the other books and sections, he's always reminded we have to look at ourselves, within ourselves. He continues, it means that we need to stop minimizing our own potency and stop blaming others. Although another person may have real issues, we still have our own ability to make a difference because God has no favorites. He is in everyone's heart. Everyone has the ability to influence their environment if they recognize their eternal identity as divine entities. That's quite a mouthful, huh? It's quite a headful. It's quite a thoughtful statement. And what I'm realizing is I'm reading, it's not a new concept he's presenting here, and if we've been studying his books and just the areas that I've covered, it's helping me see how he repeats and encourages us to know who we are as eternal divine entities. And the more we know that, we can then respect others and not try to change them to our selfish ways, but to help change them to know that they too are divine entities and that God is in their heart, and that they can examine themselves to see what may be the problem, or you having taken that action and recognizing the difference here can help them and lift them up, possibly out of their pain and hurt, as we mentioned before. That's the spiritual warrior. Number 4. Are there any questions up to this point? We're dealing with 9 positive ways to deal with shoulds and blamers that we just went over. Number 4. Try to understand the environment more closely. Comment. By closely studying the field of activities one can gain a better understanding of cause and effect, which will decrease the likelihood of an overreaction. This made me think, to help us remember when we were in anxieties, where he states sometimes that we need to carefully answer some questions. This is if anxiety is coming up, but also we can use it if we feel anger coming up or want to blame somebody or feel that somebody should. And remember the questions? What is the actual problem? What is the cause of the problem? What are the possible solutions? And what is the best solution that we can try to attain? And you can use those questions if you want to stop and try to understand the environment more closely as to what's going on. And then you won't overreact because you're looking more carefully. Number 5, revenge will only compound a problem rather than resolve it. And I'm sure all of you out there can agree with that. His commentary: revenge will just drag us down to the other person's level, hinder us from acting productively, and cause us to constantly live in the past. You know that sometimes you're going along fine, everything is fine, somebody comes up and says something and it clicks a memory. 5 years ago, 18 years ago, this happened. Oh, I didn't get even with them. 18 years? It have to let it go. Have to let it go. He says all of us have acted in unbeneficial ways in the past. So even if you've gotten yourself together now, you weren't a saint back there. You might have upset some people or persons. Ways in the past, and we hope, he says, all of us have acted in unbeneficial ways in the past, and we hope that others will forgive us. So we forgive so that we can also be forgiven. We also forgive for ourselves because we want to constantly access love. You understand? Sometimes it's pretty hard to forgive a certain situation or some words or something. But he says we want to forgive for ourselves because we want to constantly access love. And if we are forgiving that person, that means we're making contact with God, we're seeing God in them, and he reciprocates. And it's always loving reciprocation. Number 6, always look for the deeper meaning in any situation. And I know we've all used the phrase, there's a reason for everything. There are no accidents, no coincidences. Well, I don't know if we all do. I know I do. And I feel you spiritual warriors out there have also. And it's how to remember that when a situation seems to be manifesting in some way. But you look for the deeper meaning in any situation. His commentary: we do not just want to embrace the immediate, irrational expression of anger, especially since the first emotional impression can be very misleading and superficial. And that's another point where we can go back to those questions. If you're being mindful of wanting to avoid excessive anxiety and you want to manage your anger and you're consciously making the effort. So a situation arises, but if you're mindful, you'll stop and you can again ask those questions. What is the actual problem? Like, why am I letting this upset me? Or I used to use the question, what in me brought this situation about? That's a good one to use on yourself. Number 7, ask questions to get healthier feedback. You thought of that? You stop that anger expression, that irritation, that whatever, and ask, how have I disturbed you? What is disturbing you? And you try to find out. He says, good questions can give us more facts and much more insight, sympathy, and empathy. Page 31. Let's see, I made a note on that. What's on page 31? Did I put page 31? I got a question mark there. This is the chapter on excessive anxiety. I'm not quite sure why I have that there. But again, I think that's a good reminder, point to think of, to ask questions. But you ask it in a caring way, in a loving way. And as you are managing your anger of what's going on. And sometimes that's all a person needs, is to have someone ask a question in a way that shows they really care about how they're feeling at that moment. Number 8, be realistic and honest when dealing with issues. He says, in this way, all parties will know how to authentically deal with the conflict. If parties are not revealing their real fears, anxieties, and needs, the conflict will not be resolved and can even escalate. Now that one may seem a little difficult, but again, if we've been following these guys, starting from the 12 qualities of a spiritual warrior, where one of the qualities is truthfulness, and if we have been doing introspection, and if we have been able to avoid being self-centered and selfish, we will be able to be truthful. What I'm feeling at this moment is that you don't care for me, or you're not hearing me. You're not understanding what I'm saying or what I'm doing. Let me explain. And that's being truthful rather than, going the other way. So you have to reveal your fears, anxieties, and needs. And then the conflict will be resolved rather than escalate. And number 9, value other people more, he says. His commentary. If we can develop a deeper level of appreciation, whatever happens in their lives will become important to us and will help us find a way to glorify God more. If we do not value others, it will be hard to have authentic, healthy, meaningful relationships. And here again, he's reminding us of God. And he's telling us, if we develop a deeper level of appreciation, whatever happens in our lives become important to us. But it helps us also find a way to glorify God more. And how is that? Because if you're on the spiritual path, if you've been doing your spiritual disciplines and your sadhana and your understanding of who you are as a spiritual eternal entity, and your connection with God, your relationship with God is your very best friend and your controller, the arranger. We have talked on these, mentioned these as we've gone through different aspects. Then you will know God is, as he just said previously, is in everybody's heart. He's everywhere equally present. Everything comes from him. Every experience is an opportunity, a challenge, an opportunity to see God in ourselves and others. And if they don't see it, our understanding of it will come forth and can change the whole situation. And as he said, you can have authentic, healthy, and meaningful relationships. These 9 ways are really wonderful, and hopefully you have them and are working with them. The next section is called the progression of anger. Any questions, by the way, or comments up to this point? Okay. An adverse chain reaction. He states, as anger escalates, it progresses through certain steps. Mundane anger usually manifests in an adverse chain of intense verbal expressions, gestures, and mannerisms. If you've ever been on one side of a road or a street and saw 2 people angry at each other on the other side, everything is working and moving and rolling at that time. So you can understand that statement he made. He says, if we see this chain of events unfolding, we may need to act with caution because we do not want to submerge ourselves in this negativity. We can also try to help the other person avoid this intensity. He says, if we completely lose control of the anger, we may act so destructively within a relationship that it will later require more time, energy, and resources to rectify the problem and rebuild the relationship. We can avoid all this trouble simply by honoring and addressing the situation properly from the very beginning. And here we have to have had the tools, techniques, technologies that have been given to us throughout these spiritual warrior books, and a sense of self-identity as a spiritual entity, as he's been telling us all along, connected to the Supreme Lord, and that Supreme Lord being in our heart to guide us and help us in any situation. We can avoid all this trouble simply by honoring and addressing the situation properly from the very beginning. That's where that wish, coulda, shoulda. If you don't do that, then you walk around, I could have, I should have, why didn't I? And then that just builds up to more anxiety, and that anxiety can lead to the first thing the person says or situation, you pop off and in an angry way. So we have to be mindful of ourselves, our thoughts, our words, and what's going on. He says, this is if you handle addressing the situation properly from the beginning. Then we will feel happier in our lives and have the ability to give more value to others. We will develop spirituality in a very dynamic way. Here he's showing us what the ultimate goal is. All of this is to develop spirituality to such a dynamic way that we're not affected by somebody else's mood or somebody else's anger or whatever. We'll be able to make that connection, ask the proper question, act in a selfless way, and bring some harmony or balance. And if not, to just leave the situation until the other person calms down rather than reacting. Here he's giving techniques. He says, the following techniques can help us recognize anger when it begins to escalate. He's just helping us on. Now let's see. Techniques to recognize the progression of anger. Number 1, check the habit of mind reading. His commentary. Mind reading happens when one person speculates about the thoughts of another person, accepts the speculation as true, and then acts on the speculation. We can stop this by taking more time to understand the person's real intentions and concerns. How many times has he mentioned just in this brief reading I've done tonight how important it is to pay attention to what's going on with the other person, to value another person. Number 2, implement time out in negative situations. Now, when you have a kid that's acting up, how many of you have children? You put them on time out. What? To give them time to figure it out? Let's see what his commentary is on this one. Now, this is a technique to recognize the progression of anger. He says, for instance, if a situation simply turns into a combative conflict, we could say, maybe we should finish this conversation tomorrow or this evening. That's when you're in a balanced place. In this way, did you hear that? Let me read. You could say, maybe we should finish this conversation tomorrow or this evening. I don't want to stop. You did it. All right. We can still discuss it later. And if you're in that, and if it's coming, as he said earlier here, from a place of love, it'll wait. He says, in this way, we will have a greater chance to address the conflict in a rational way and to access a loving connection rather than an unhealthy emotional one. He's reminded us of the importance of the character and quality of love. He states, this technique...
There's a question.
It's a question? All right, just let me finish this sentence. Hold it, don't lose it. This technique can help some of you as you deal with your children. If their behavior leads you to feel irrational anger, it might help to punish them at a later time when you can address the behavior in a more rational manner. Okay, there's a question?
Yes, from Buddha Mohan. How can we be properly attentive to others when we might sometimes appear aloof to their needs because we might be engaged in a spiritual practice that makes us appear uninterested in their mundane concerns?
What an interesting question. what I'm getting, if we are engaged in a spiritual practice that has the qualities and characteristics that are being presented about valuing others, respecting others, knowing that God is in everybody's heart and that He never takes a vacation, He's always present, we can, I want to use the word discriminate, I think we went through that, or discern at that moment how important it is to give some attention to that person, if I'm understanding the question. In our scriptures, I think there's stories of people being in meditation and someone coming up. I think in Srimad Bhagavatam, how many stories are there of meditation being interrupted? But again, if we're in the selfless mood, if we are actually deeply immersed in our spiritual life, we will know. You know what just came to mind? Haridas Thakur, was he chanting? And he was really into his chanting, and yet when that prostitute came and tried to, he stopped for a moment to say to her, okay, I will, but I must finish my rounds. And he went back to chanting. I think that's a good example, in my mind, of being involved spiritually, something occurring, and being able to stop lovingly and just ask him, her, or what to wait or take care of it and then go back. I hope that helps. Okay? Any other? Okay. If you want more on that, let's talk more. So we're talking here about implementing time out in negative situation. He's given the example of parent and child. He says you let them know that you disapprove of their actions, but you give them the chastisement at a time when you have more control over your anger. In this way, the chastisement will proportionately correspond to the issue so that it will bring rectification instead of an assault or devastation. Time out will give us a chance to read, chant, pray, or meditate, which will remind us about the purpose of the relationship and about our own real identity. And what has he been telling us is our real identity. We are spiritual beings, eternal beings, part and parcel of the Supreme Lord. And sometimes in this material environment, in the energies, we have a tendency to forget. So a time out is a wonderful opportunity to do that. And as you say, if it's something you say to the partner, we can finish this later. He says, most importantly, it will give us an opportunity to give more care and love. We do not simply want to prove the other person wrong or take revenge through retaliation. Not spiritual warriors, not us. Even after reflecting on the situation, we may still conclude that the other person has acted improperly. However, now that we have come to a healthy understanding, we can try to facilitate in a positive way. Number 3. These are techniques to recognize the progression of anger. He says, monitor our self-talk. Self-talk refers to the positive, or negative things that we tell ourselves. And for the average person, studies indicate that the majority of thoughts are negative. Many people focus solely on their weaknesses and the reasons for such weaknesses. They meditate on the people who anger them and the reasons for their anger. The list goes on and on. For this reason, it is very important to acknowledge the power of the mind, which can be our greatest enemy, If we do not check such negativity, these harmful messages will control us. And again, we're being given instructions of how we must monitor ourselves. I'd like to go back to remembering the first spiritual quality of a spiritual warrior is mastering the mind. If you're working on that, you'll be able to see how that mind is trying to pull us away from moving ahead spiritually. And one more before we close tonight. Number 4. He suggested, what are we working on? We're working on techniques to recognize the progression of anger. He states, write verses or notes on a set of cards that we can access in urgent situations. In this way, when we find ourselves overwhelmed by our emotions, we can try to review one of the cards describing the proper way to act in a certain situation. We can record many different prayers or spiritual perspectives to help us under all types of circumstances. That, I think, is a wonderful advice and a good way to bring this evening to a close of the reading if you have any questions. But this is wonderful. You write verses or notes on a set and you can keep them in your pocket, in your pocketbook. Because sometimes we do get so involved that we forget our spiritual discipline or under the discipline we've been practicing. But something could start, and then sure enough, if you'll remember, and you could even just say, hold it a minute, and you pull out your card and you see, oh, monitor my self-talk. Oh, value the other person. Oh, yeah, I have been trying to read his mind. I don't really know what he's doing. Let me ask a question. And see, this is what you've been getting. I hope some of you have this book. As I've said many times, you can purchase these Spiritual Warrior books on Krishna.com store and do your own studying and writing and understanding and working with these things. So I don't know if anybody has used any of the techniques, technology that we've been talking about over the last couple of weeks on anxiety and now on anger, that you've noticed any change and you want to share. We could take a moment to do that, and I'll give you a moment to do that. Or any questions on what we have gone through so far this evening.
Bhuvan Mohan says, thank you, Mother Indrani. Excellent class, thought-provoking insights.
Thank you, Bhuvan Mohan, for your kind words. Thank you very much. Anybody else? No. No. Okay, spiritual warriors on the battlefield for a week, practicing managing your anger and checking out on your anxiety, and we've covered so many wonderful concepts, ideas, techniques. Prayfully, you have a wonderful week, and we'll meet again next Thursday. Hare Krishna.